away what they got away with taking hundreds of billions and trillions of dollars right out of our pocket. They took advantage of us.
Welcome to the Lauder Institute at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm Jules van Binsbergen, director of the Institute and a finance professor at the Wharton School.
And I'm Jonathan Berk, a finance professor at the Graduate School of Business at Stanford University. This is the All Else Equal podcast.
Welcome back, everybody. Today's topic nicely dovetails with the topic that we did last episode. 2 weeks ago, we talked about tariffs and the rationale for tariffs. And one reason that the Trump administration announced they wanted to do tariffs was because they felt like the trade deficit with particular countries was too large, and that tariffs would be a remedy to try to reduce those trade deficits with those countries. So today, what we want to discuss is a couple things. First, what exactly are trade deficits? Two, are tariffs effective ways of manipulating or reducing them? And three, what is going to be the long-term influence from using tariffs this way on economic activity in the United States and the rest of the world?
You know, Jules, I often joke that if I became president, my first act will be to change the name of the trade deficit to the capital surplus.
No, yeah, Jonathan, you're so right. I mean, just think about it in a very simple way, right? If you deliver more goods to me today than I deliver goods to you, it just means that I owe you money and that you therefore have a claim to my future income. And so that's really what this is all about. And so the fact that the capital account and the trade accounts are fundamentally linked with each other is definitely something we will have to discuss today.
Our guest today is John Cochrane. He has appeared on our podcast before. He was, for many years, a professor at the University of Chicago in the Booth School. And in 2015, he moved to Stanford and joined the Hoover Institution. John, welcome to the show.
John, we're super happy that you're with us.
It's a pleasure to be here, guys.
So, John, why do you think policymakers are fixated with the trade deficit?
Because economic fallacies die hard. And this one is, so of course, mercantilism is very attractive. The idea that we need to export more than we import, I think it generalizes from personal experience that you want to save rather than, continually borrow. And that's sort of sensible personal financial advice. I think it also, there's the fallacy of composition, the lift yourself up from your bootstraps problem, that clearly a business who is coming in screaming for protection, you will help them if you give them protection, but you'll hurt everybody else a little bit. And to a politician or to, many people, you think you can do the economy better by giving everybody a subsidy. But of course, we understand that has to come out. Not all the children can be above average. So there's some standard fallacies that lead easily to the surprising conclusion that, in fact, free trade is the right answer.
So do you think that, because this is the worry that we often hear people say, is it possible to just have a trade deficit with the rest of the world forever? And I think that there's some parallels here with government debt. We had discussions in the past about this. Can you have growing government debt forever? Can you have a trade deficit forever? And if so, why is it that people do not seem to realize this? Or if not, why not?
Well, first, there's a goods trade deficit and a services trade deficit. And our politicians are focused on goods. And there's the overall trade deficit, which is those two. And that has to be matched by a capital account surplus. So let me unpack for our listeners.
Thank you.
If China sends us stuff, we give them dollars. Now, in the first instance, you might say, that's great. They work hard, put stuff on boat, and they take pieces of paper in return. Wouldn't that be lovely? And if they're willing to accumulate endless pieces of paper, then that would be lovely and could go on forever. But alas, the Chinese are not so dumb. They use those pieces of paper to turn around and invest in U.S. securities. Again, you say, boy, that's nice. First, they work hard to send us stuff, and then they invest in the U.S., not in China. I mean, this is a real tragedy for China. They want to save a lot. They should be investing in China. Instead, they're investing in the U.S., and that's what is the mirror image of the trade deficit. So you must understand, for every trade deficit, goods or services coming in, capital account must go out. Claims to either money or claims to U.S. assets must go out. You're nodding because that's too easy for us. We've got to remember that's not easy for us. Now, can that go on forever? There's some technical ways in which it might, like, for example, if we are investing in risky assets abroad, but basically no, like government debt. The point is the Chinese are trying to save. They're accumulating assets in the U.S. Eventually, their hope is that they will be able to dissave, that we will send them stuff on boats to finance their retirement when they all grow old. Now, they've taken a lot of U.S. paper that we can inflate away or default on, and they've taken a lot of claims to U.S. capital that we can nationalize or tax away. So we might well welch on this, but if we don't welch on it, and you can only welch unexpectedly, you can only do it once. The Argentinians have welched on that claim many times, but for the purposes of policy, it's better not to do crazy stuff and just, what your mother told you when you invest. If you borrow, you got to pay it back.
So, John, I think here the personal analogies actually makes more sense. So you could think of China, both China and Japan have huge aging problems, right? They know that eventually they're going to have far fewer people producing and many people in retirement not producing. And so if you're in those economies, the optimal thing to do is to invest abroad, right? Basically save for those states. So in that sense, aren't these countries doing exactly the optimal thing?
Not obviously. So I think you're exactly right. We've jumped quickly past 3 hours of the usual tariff conversation to recognize that the trade deficit comes from fundamentally a difference between savings and investment. And until the savings and investment is not changed, the overall trade deficit cannot change. We can tariff one thing, we can raise the exchange rate, we can move it from one kind of thing to another, but the overall trade deficit is the mirror image of the capital account surplus. That is because China saves more than invest, and because we save less than we invest. So they are going to basically put investment goods on container ships and send them to us. Now, is the savings to consumption ratio in these countries optimal? There are some distortions. So China encourages savings by not really having a welfare state. They tax it a lot. There's some pro-investment policies in China. They take a lot of their citizens' money and pour it into, there's a lot of bad investment going on in China, roads nowhere. We have many pro-consumption policies. So our national savings, the fact that the government is dissaving trillions of dollars a year, government is borrowing money from China, giving it to people to consume. So there's a lot of pro-consumption distortions in the U.S. And there's all this talk among our international friends about savings gluts and psychology. I don't know what that's about. So I don't, even though I'm a Chicago economist, I don't want to jump to the savings consumption ratio is exactly optimal. It's distorted by many things. But it is true that your story is a perfectly sensible one. And I want to always start with the sensible one. They're aging. When they're middle-aged, they want to save. The tragedy is that their saving is not matched by investment in China. Their desire to save should be financing all sorts of growth-enhancing investment in China. Instead, it's financing investment in the U.S. So even the people who say there's pro-saving policy in China and underconsumption and all that sort of stuff, if China were a great place for investment, then we wouldn't be having a trade. So just because they want to save, you said why they want to save, but that doesn't mean they want to save abroad. They want to save abroad because investment opportunities are better in the U.S. than in China, at least as they perceive them.
Could that be endogenous? Could the fact that they have this aging problem in China be the reason they don't have investment opportunities?
One of many reasons. Now, the rest of the world is aging too.
Yeah.
Japan, South Korea, all have this aging problem. China is far from free market, libertarian nirvana, bedeviled by a low birth rate. There's all sorts of reasons why people don't want to invest in China, but that's certainly one of them.
So would that then also be an explanation for the fact that China isn't just investing in the US, right? So one continent that is still growing in population is Africa, and there seems to be a very large amount of investment in Africa going on as well. So is that proportional, or do you think that there's too much investment going on in the US for some reason compared to where they invest in the rest of the world? Or is it just that generally speaking, they're saving a lot because of the right reasons, and they're just spreading this around with the rest of the world, and that's fine?
Well, my understanding, a lot of what they're doing in Africa is government or semi-government and has a lot of political reasons as well as saving reasons. Although, we've all been saying we need to provide infrastructure for Africa for 20 years, and the World Bank and so forth weren't doing a particularly good job of it. The Chinese are doing it, and we're complaining a lot about that. So, where's the high marginal return investment? This public investment, I don't know. We've been saying Africa's a high marginal return for years. Can China do it? Before you get all excited about this, though, people say, oh, they're putting Africa under their thumb. The airports and the ports are in Africa. And anytime they get tired of it, they can just say, we're nationalizing. So the Chinese, again, we keep saying there's something nefarious about it, but they're really putting trust in the rest of us to pay them back.
Along the same lines, is there a lot of evidence that trade deficits are related to economic growth?
Yeah, I don't know the academic papers, but I think yes. Not deficits, but openness to trade is certainly on casual empiricism. The most prosperous countries throughout history were the ones that were wide open to trade. From, Venice in the 1400s to Florence in the late 1400s to Holland in the 1600s.
Don't forget about Jules's home country.
Yeah. And Hong Kong until China took it over, and Singapore and Luxembourg, they're small, but openness to trade has always been. And in part, this is, I think, what we're missing. Tariff analysis is often static, but let's look at the opposite. Countries that have erected tariff and protection barriers, how's that worked out for you, both on security grounds and economic grounds? So India practiced, they say the English gave them railroads and socialism. They practiced import substitution, put up high tariff barriers to get that Indian car manufacturing industry going. That's worked great. India is just a powerhouse for cars. Europe, every country in Europe put up barriers, and they got Fiat and Peugeot and, Volkswagen made decent cars, although Fiat used to stand for fix it again, Tony, but they're not doing wonderfully. We protected steel and shipping. The result being we have this horribly protected and inefficient steel industry and produce zero ships thanks to our extensive protection. So protection has always led to stagnation, lack of innovation, and companies that are really good at getting more protection. And I think that's pretty clear on the historical record.
So, John, if we look at current policies, particularly how Trump is linking tariffs to the trade deficit, it seems that there's a broader geopolitical and democratic angle to consider. Many people view the tariff announcements positively, seeing them as a way of standing up for communities that have long been priced out of the market. We recently discussed this with Danny Roderick, and the takeaway was similar to yours. Tariffs likely won't solve the underlying issues. So if we accept that there is a disenfranchised group in need of support, what's the most effective way to reintegrate them into the US economy beyond just protecting them with tariffs?
So the curious thing about tariffs, there's a couple of curious things about tariffs as policy that make it hard for us as economists. One is that the economic answer is very simple: unilateral free trade. We all know that.
Yeah.
What makes it hard is that your job from there on in is answer 100 fallacies. So you have to understand and be able to explain why 100 fallacies are wrong, not just understand why the underlying thing is right. Second problem, which I think goes straight to your question, is that clearly in the current administration and many past ones, tariffs are an answer wildly in search of a question. It is clear they decided on tariffs. Why are the tariffs? Well, the reasons keep changing, and that tells you why it's an answer to the question. The minute you say, here is a question, counter China's defense industry, increase U.S. manufacturing, help disenfranchised people, the minute you state a question, an optimal answer comes that has nothing to do with the tariffs that they're imposing. I mean, tariffs on avocados from Mexico are not going to do a lot to stop China from invading Taiwan or, to bring back some vision of 1950s manufacturing. So are these about the disenfranchised people? The China shock was very small. And, you look at the number of people who actually lost jobs. And, that was also 15 years ago. That's not a huge number of people. Most of them retired. You can't really see China's accession to the WTO on U.S. manufacturing output. There's a very good comment I saw recently. This is a case where applied micro has hurt us. It is true you do difference in difference, and places that were more exposed to the China trade shock did slightly worse than places that were less exposed. But the whole economy, the U.S. economy, has grown like crazy. We have a 4% unemployment rate. where are all these people who, supposedly there's this mass of unemployed people who lost their jobs to China shock. They're not there. There is an underemployment problem in the U.S. There's a lower segment of U.S. society that is not employed, but it's not from lack of jobs. They face social problems with 100% marginal tax rates. They're on fentanyl. There's sort of depths of despair. Bringing back shoe factories to South Carolina, then nobody wants those jobs. They're not going to take low-wage manufacturing jobs, and they don't have the skill. If you want to bring back manufacturing, Apple's Tim Cook just had a great video on Twitter. He says, we're not doing it in the U.S., not because it's not a low-wage question. China's not low-wage. They just have thousands of really good product engineers. It is now skilled labor to do manufacturing. The people who've been sitting around for 10 years, cashing a government check, are not able to take 12-hour-a-day jobs assembling iPhones or even the high-tech manufacturing they're doing.
Agreed.
There is a problem in the U.S. of people stuck outside of labor force, low social connection, labor force participation. Tariffs on China or tariffs on everything are not going to do anything with those people. Once you state that as the question, tariffs are not the answer.
So let me ask the painful question, which is, let's assume Trump proceeds and imposes the tariffs. What is going to happen?
I am very sad about this because I think it's going to be much worse economically than we think. Now, initially, I thought tariffs is not so bad. A 10% tariff, well, a tariff is a corporate tax that gets passed on in terms of higher prices. We have a 10% sales tax. We have corporate taxes. Those are all passed on in terms of higher prices and lower wages. Once you start talking about 50 and 100% tariffs, remember a good principle for your listeners: the damage of a tax rate is proportional to the square of the tax rate. So 100% tariff, that's a lot more squared than a 10% tariff. So number one, that static damage is huge. Number two, there's all these supply chains which were blowing up. And we saw in COVID, that was the big supply chain blow up, a big supply shock. This is bigger in terms of just blowing up whole business models. There's no way to move factories back. First of all, it takes 5 years to get the permits to do anything in the U.S., and then we don't have the skilled workers to do it. So that can't happen for 5 years. We're just going to be a real blow up of all sorts of parts of the U.S. economy. And, when everything at Walmart doubles in price, we're a couple of months away from that. If 100% tariffs on China go through, everything in Walmart doubles in price, along with a lot of jobs getting lost. So imagine how Trump's base is going to feel about this. So I think the economic damage is going to be bad. The deeper damage, the uncertainty effect. Of course, everyone knows that the minute the next Democratic administration comes in, it's all gone. So there's no point in investing in something that takes advantage of tariffs while it's up and down. So investment is going to collapse. This is going to be a repeat of 1979, a big stagflationary shock. There's going to be bankruptcies. I think the economic damage is going to be quite big. Which also, makes me sad. I was kind of hopeful for many things the Trump administration was going to do. Just yesterday, they gave us back shower heads that work. Yeah.
Yeah, I saw that. I was very happy.
Hallelujah. And that's one of 100 executives. They ended the energy insanity of the Biden administration. They ended the AI regulation. It was going to kill AI. There was all sorts of good stuff. But if there's a big recession, a big stagflationary recession, then all of the popular support for that goes. And I actually think the political damage and the foreign policy damage are worse than the economic damage. We've also managed to piss off the world, all of our friends. And when China blockades Taiwan and we go calling around the world to say, hey, we really want you to participate in sanctions, they're going to say, oh, yeah, you're the guy who just passed tariffs on all our stuff and started a trade war. And now you want us not to buy cheap stuff from China while our economies are tanking too? No, thank you. So pissing off the world is additional collateral damage. So that's why I'm very worried and sad about this greatest, Janet Yellen called it the greatest unforced error, I think, in economic policymaking. And having been there for the 10% inflation, she knows something about unforced errors in macroeconomic policymaking.
But let's say this, John, where I think you're right and where I think we really have to worry is I think macroeconomists got a little bit of a surprise during COVID to find out that supply chains matter and they affect inflation. So I think your observation that the tariffs differentially change the cost of goods, which then affects supply chains, is a very insightful point. And just looking at saying, well, look, what percentage is imported? How much will that cause a price change? I think is underestimating the inflationary effect of this.
Yeah, and I would add, so we think of China as, sneakers made in sweatshops at Walmart and say, okay, pay double for your sneakers. No, half of the imports from China are industrial inputs and manufactured goods. If you want to make a factory in the US to build stuff in the US, all the machine tools come from China. Now, taxing stuff that is used by our businesses to make things at huge rates, that just blows up all the business. So this is a high-tech version of the story that taxing steel hurts the car companies more than it helps the steel companies because the car companies need to make steel. They were also done in a very blunderbuss way. So in a supply chain economy, lots of stuff goes back and forth across the border many times. Now, under the current tariffs, you don't get credit for what you've exported. So if a part is in a car and it goes back and across the border 5 times, you tariff it 5 times.
Yeah.
That kind of minor problem is chaos.
So in that sense, it's different than a tax, right? Because usually taxes are on value-added pieces, not on the whole thing.
Yes. If you're going to do tariffs, they should be on value-added, not on the gross quantity. We're doing 100% on the gross quantity.
So, John, on a previous podcast, Jules and I reflected on the fact that, Trump, with the fact that he has the strategy, which nobody can predict, gives him a lot of power. So what do you think of the probability that in the end, he'll negotiate no tariffs anywhere?
Yeah, so that's, of the many questions to which tariffs is an answer. Maybe this is a negotiating tactic. Maybe he's playing 4-dimensional chess. Now, I don't think that makes much sense. When you hear his advisors, there seem to be 2 teams, and one says this is a negotiating tactic and a bluff on the way to global free trade, get them to lower their tariffs, and we want to go to 0 tariffs. Now, from an economic point of view, I just want to remind our listeners, you do not need to have fair trade. It's still to our advantage to have no tariffs, no matter what the foreigners do. If they want to shoot themselves in the foot, still to your advantage not to shoot yourself in the foot. We can get to that. But it would be nice. The U.S. spent 70 years working on, let's move slowly towards a world of open capital markets and free trade. But on the other hand, you hear from other parts of the administration where very clearly they think the point of tariffs is to have 0 trade deficit in goods with every individual country. And they're really loud about that. So is the goal, 0 trade deficit with every country, whether or not they charge tariffs, or is the goal simultaneous lowering of tariffs? If it were we're going to bully you into lowering your tariffs, I would think they would be clear about that. So, a mugger comes to you and he says, Jonathan, give me your money. He doesn't say, I'm going to shoot till you do something. He says, give me your money. So you would think that this would be very clear from the administration. We are raising tariffs until we get a deal where everybody lowers tariffs. And they also keep changing the goalposts. Now it's not just lower tariffs, but now it's lower subsidies. And now you have to also tariff China. So it is not clear to me that is the end, though I know many, including good friends in the administration, are trying hard to rescue it by turning it that way. It's also a dangerous strategy. You can bully your friends only so many times, and it really pisses them off. So, what Trump has apparently managed to do is rescue the Canadian Liberals. Poilievre was going to destroy them in the next election, and now, the Liberals are back up. And I think it's, helping jingoistic and xenophobic sentiment all over the place. Europe is really pissed off at us. I would hope that's my best hope for an outcome, but there's so much sentiment of we're going to have tariffs for the sake of tariffs. And the point, as you say, the questions keep changing. It's to rescue the middle class. It's to bring manufacturing back. It's to have 0 trade deficits, that I think we're just going to keep having different questions no matter what the answer is.
Yeah, I'll tell you an anecdote which shook me to the core. Was I was in Canada, in the Rocky Mountains of British Columbia, in a small town. Now, that is very conservative part of Canada. And I went into a bar and I decided I'm going to have a bourbon. And I said to the bartender, can I have a bourbon? He goes, we don't have any bourbon. And at first I thought, did I hear him right? What does it mean he doesn't have any bourbon? I wasn't asking for a specific bourbon. I was just asking for a bourbon. I looked at him and said, what do you mean? He goes, no, we don't have any American alcohol in this bar. And it shook me. I mean, this is our greatest ally. And we're in the most conservative part of our greatest ally. And so, your sense of how much Trump is spending the goodwill that America developed over the last 80 years is frightening. I agree with you.
There was another question to which tariffs was the answer, which was the idea of we're going to isolate China and run this great economic war against China. I think that was a bad idea, but if that was the question, these tariffs seem singularly, even though we're really beating up on China, singularly ineffective to that, because then you want people to trade with us. So if you want to gang up on China, you want Canada and Latin America, you want to say to them, look, we would rather you didn't buy $20,000 electric cars from BYD. We would like you to buy $150,000, including all the subsidies, electric cars from Ford and GM. Well, are they going to be in a mood to do that now? I think we're driving a lot of the world into China's hands. We are going to create a trading bloc, which is the US, and another trading bloc, which is everybody else, and everybody else will include China. We bailed out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now they're on their own. What is the incentive for people to say, well, we're going to just give up on all this free stuff from China because we love the US after we're doing this to them?
John, we live in a very strange world, and you're as worried as I am, obviously.
I'm worried. Let's say a few positive things. I want to repeat, there was so much good coming out of the Trump administration. I mean, the end of DEI in our own university was going to be a wonderful thing. And the domestic political fallout means if this does go in the direction of a recession, substantial pain for Trump's supporters, lose the midterms, DEI is going to be right back 4 years from now. That's just a small instance of all the great stuff that was happening, somewhat chaotically. You may not like how Doge was working, but there was real promise here. And if it plays out as we think it plays out, not only is it going to be economically really bad, it's going to be politically really bad.
Well, John, this has been a wide-ranging conversation, but it's been really, I think most of our listeners are going to find it very interesting and edifying because, as you say, the common understanding of the relation of tariffs, trade deficits, and economic well-being is not very well understood.
Yes, and it is interesting. Among us economists, it seems so obvious. I have a trade deficit with the grocery store and a capital account surplus. I mean, they don't buy anywhere near as much from me as I buy from them. If tariffs were good between countries, why are tariffs not good between states? Aha! Maybe there's a point there. I mean, it seems so basic to us, but it is very hard. It's very interesting how hard it is to explain all these fallacies over and over again.
Well, thank you very much, John.
John, thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to All Else Equal podcast. Please leave us a review at Apple Podcasts. We love to hear from our listeners. And be sure to catch our next episode by subscribing or following the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. For more information and episodes, visit allelseequalpodcast.com or follow us on LinkedIn. The All Else Equal podcast is a joint production of the Lauder Institute at the University of Pennsylvania and the Graduate School of Business at Stanford University, and is produced